My name's Henry. I'm a recent college graduate with a degree in graphic design, and I've been applying to jobs like crazy while working on the side to make ends meet. It was around this time that I came across a job posting at a local grocery store. The ad was handwritten, taped to the wall near the entrance. Overnight security needed, it read. Private cemetery. Must be available for 10-hour shifts, $30 an hour. I thought, $30 an hour? For just sitting in a cemetery overnight? Easy money. I gave the number a call and a woman answered. She didn't give me much info, but she confirmed that the job was real and told me to show up at 7 p.m. sharp for my first shift. Her voice was odd, flat, detached, as if she didn't care one way or another whether I showed up or not. But hey, I was desperate, and the money sounded too good to pass up. The drive there took about 25 minutes, winding through narrow dirt roads that seemed to cut deeper and deeper into the thick woods. The trees here were dense, blotting out any light as dusk settled in. The road was pitted with potholes, and as I rounded a bend, a rusted iron gate covered in moss loomed up before me. I could barely make out rows of headstones scattered across the field inside, stretching as far as I could see until they were swallowed by the trees. Following the directions, I drove down the narrow road until I spotted a small hut in the middle of the cemetery. The place looked ancient, barely holding up under its own weight, with a single dim bulb hanging from the awning. There was a car parked outside, and as I pulled up, a man with heavy bags under his eyes stepped out. The guard looked rough, probably in his late 40s. He didn't say much as he eyed me up and down, but as he turned to leave, he stopped, looking back at me with an expression that could almost pass for concern. "You're not new, are you?" Yeah. This is my first night," I replied, feeling a twinge of unease. "Damn it," he muttered, digging in his backpack and pulling out a small, crumpled piece of laminated paper. "Here, take this, and don't lose it." His hands were shaking slightly as he handed it to me. Are you okay, man?" I asked, thrown off by the look in his eyes. He just stared at me, eyes wide and bloodshot. "Follow the rules, kid. We don't need to lose another one." And with that, he jumped in his car and peeled off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Standing there in the fading light, I unfolded the paper and scanned the list. The rules were strange, cryptic, stuff I'd never seen on any security job. Don't investigate ringing bells, no matter how close they sound. If bugs start landing on the windows, burn the candles under the desk. If pebbles are thrown at the glass, turn off the light and hide until the laughing stops. If you see gravestones appear or disappear, pour oil over them. Do not approach the gravedigger if he comes by. Do not go past the great angel grave. Only answer the initial call on the radio. Lock the hut each time you go outside. Don't leave the hut for more than 10 minutes at a time. If you see someone else in the hut when you return, get in your car and drive. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Surely this had to be a joke, right? Some kind of weird initiation? But as I stood there, alone in the growing darkness, the strange, heavy silence around me started to settle in. With a deep breath, I stepped inside the hut, trying to shake off the unease creeping over me. The tiny room was lit by a single, low-hanging bulb, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A battered stool sat by a wooden desk cluttered with a ham radio, an ashtray, and a few candles. The silence was thick, unnatural. Not even a cricket chirped in the distance. And then, suddenly, the radio crackled to life, making me jump. Static filled the air, followed by a voice. It was the woman I'd spoken to earlier. "Read the instructions carefully," she said, her voice low and unfeeling. "Follow them exactly. If you lose the paper, let me know, and I'll text you a photo. Your shift ends at 5 a.m. Good night." The line went dead with a final click. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and saw a notification, a message from an unknown number. 2 months' pay has been deposited into your account. I refreshed my banking app, and there it was. The amount was real, staring back at me. I was now officially locked into this weird job, whether I liked it or not. Before I could wrap my head around it, something hit the glass window beside me. A rock, small but loud enough to jolt me out of my thoughts. I looked around, but all I saw were the graves, scattered and silent under the moonlight. I settled back into my seat, trying to focus on my phone, but then, clink, another rock. I felt my stomach twist as I remembered rule number 3. If pebbles are thrown at the glass, turn off the light and hide under the desk until the laughing stops. I reached for the switch, clicked the light off, and slid under the desk. My breath hitched as I heard another soft clink. Then a faint giggle echoed outside. A child's laugh, soft but chilling. The laughing grew louder, echoing around the hut, seeming to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I pressed my hands over my mouth, hoping it would end. For half an hour, I sat under that desk, heart hammering, as the laughter continued, growing louder and more twisted with each minute. Finally, it faded and the silence returned. When I dared to look out, the graves lay still, bathed in a thin veil of fog. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the first light crept into the sky, the car from the previous night returned. The man stepped out, looking as exhausted as he had when I first met him. "Hand me the paper," he said. "You're lucky you don't have the morning rules." He offered no further explanation as he took the paper, leaving me with more questions than I'd started with. I headed home, sleep eluding me as I replayed every strange moment in my mind. The second shift loomed closer, and I couldn't help but dread it. Despite the unease from my first shift, the deposit in my bank account was hard to ignore. I figured it was a one-time deal, a rough first night to test me. By the time my second shift came around, I'd mostly convinced myself it was just an elaborate prank or initiation ritual. I arrived back at the cemetery around 6:45 p.m. The sky was dim, streaked with the last colors of dusk. The rusty iron gate creaked as I drove through, the silhouettes of headstones emerging like silent sentinels in the fading light. A slight fog hung in the air, thicker than before. It gave everything an ethereal, unsettling quality. The hut looked the same as last night. Small, weathered, barely held together. I parked and stepped inside, flicking on the light and glancing around. Everything was just as I'd left it. The ham radio sat silent on the desk, the candles untouched, and my laminated list of rules lay exactly where I'd put it. As soon as I sat down, my phone buzzed with a message from the unknown number. "Read the rules carefully and stick to them. Failure to comply will result in termination." The wording struck me as odd. Termination? Of the job or of me? I shook off the thought, dismissing it as paranoia, and settled in for what I hoped would be an uneventful night. Hours passed in silence. Midnight approached, and nothing had happened. I started scrolling through my phone, feeling my eyes grow heavy. But just as I was nodding off, I heard a faint sound outside. A soft scraping. Metal on stone. My heart jumped as I remembered rule number 5. If a gravedigger comes, do not approach him. Let him come to the window. He will stare at you for a few hours but will leave after. Do not go outside while he's here. I glanced out the window and froze. There, about 20 feet from the hut, was a figure hunched over a grave, holding a shovel. He looked like he'd stepped out of another era, dressed in tattered clothes and a long dark coat. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, shadowed so I couldn't make out any features. I gripped the edge of the desk, my pulse racing. He moved slowly, scraping the shovel against the grave in slow, deliberate movements, as if he were savoring each dig. For a second, I wondered if he was real, or just some kind of apparition tied to the cemetery. He didn't seem to notice me. I reminded myself of the rule. Do not approach him. Let him come to the window. After what felt like hours, he finally straightened, leaving his shovel stuck in the ground. He turned toward the hut and I caught a glimpse of his face under the hat. His eyes were hollow, dark pits, with a faint red glow. He began walking toward me in slow, measured steps. My first instinct was to run, to jump in my car and peel out of there. But I forced myself to stay still, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I glanced down at the rules, double-checking that I hadn't misread it. Let him come to the window. "Don't go outside." When he reached the window, he leaned in close, pressing his face against the glass. His eyes, empty and glowing, locked onto mine. He didn't move. He just stared. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded so hard I thought he could hear it. I couldn't break eye contact. It was as if his gaze held me in place, trapping me in some strange, silent understanding that I wasn't welcome here, that I didn't belong. Eventually, I don't know how much later, he straightened and turned away, heading back into the fog. He picked up his shovel, resumed his digging, and disappeared into the darkness. I exhaled a shaky breath, realizing only then how cold the room had become. My breath hung in the air, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I felt like I'd just barely passed some kind of twisted test, but I had no idea what the consequences of failure might have been. As I sat back, trying to calm my racing heart, the radio crackled to life. I jumped, half expecting to hear that creepy voice from before, but it was only static. I remembered rule number 7. Do not answer anyone talking from the HAM radio, except for the initial call when you came in. Ignoring the radio, I checked my phone again. No new messages. The silence stretched, and I sat there, feeling the weight of each rule pressing down on me. Why were they so specific? Why did it feel like my every move was being watched? Then, around 3 a.m., I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. One of the gravestones had shifted. It wasn't where I remembered it being. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but sure enough, the stone was now a few feet closer to the hut. I checked the list. Rule number 4. If gravestones begin to appear and reappear, go outside and pour oil over them. Oil is located under the desk. I took a deep breath, grabbed the oil can from under the desk, and stepped outside. The air was thick with fog, clinging to me like a cold, damp sheet. I moved quickly, pouring the oil over the gravestone, hoping that would somehow reset it. As soon as I'd finished, I hurried back to the hut, locking the door behind me. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each moment bringing a new layer of unease. I was beginning to feel like a puppet in some twisted play, following these bizarre rules with no idea why or what would happen if I slipped up. Finally, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, dispelling the fog and casting the cemetery in a soft, gray light. The old guard's car pulled up and he stepped out, looking as tired and haunted as ever. He nodded at me, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pity. "Another night done," he said, reaching for the rule sheet. "Get some rest, Henry. You're gonna need it." As I handed over the paper, he hesitated, his eyes scanning my face. For a moment, he looked like he was about to say something, but then he just shook his head and walked back to his car. I drove home, the weight of the night hanging heavy on me. My mind filled with questions I couldn't answer. By the time my third shift came around, the initial thrill of the high pay had been thoroughly overshadowed by dread. The events of the previous nights replayed in my mind, each bizarre rule haunting me as I tried to make sense of them. Every step of the routine felt carefully calculated, as though this cemetery demanded not only vigilance but obedience. I arrived at the cemetery just before 7 p.m., the night already pressing down like a dark shroud. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, winding between the graves like grasping fingers. The closer I got to the hut, the more the world around me seemed to fade into an eerie silence. Stepping inside, I found the laminated rules exactly where I'd left them, worn and browning at the edges. I scanned them again, as if expecting the text to have changed, but it remained the same, each rule just as strange and unforgiving. The ham radio crackled to life again as soon as I sat down. The woman's voice, cold and flat, filled the silence. "Make sure you have the rules on hand, Henry. This will be a long night." I shivered, the weight of her words pressing down on me. There was no reassurance in her voice, only a matter-of-fact warning that left me feeling isolated and vulnerable. As I settled in, the hours ticked by slowly. Midnight came and went without incident, and I felt my initial tension ease a bit. I allowed myself a brief moment of hope that tonight might actually be quiet, but, as I would soon learn, the cemetery was only waiting for my guard to drop. Around 1 a.m., the familiar sound of something tapping against the hut's glass returned. Clink. My heart skipped as I remembered rule number 3. If pebbles are thrown at the hut's glass, turn the light off and hide under the desk until the laughing stops. I reached for the light, my hand shaking as I flicked it off and dropped to the floor, squeezing myself under the desk. The darkness was suffocating, pressing down on me as I waited, barely daring to breathe. My eyes strained to see, but the night was impenetrable. Then, the laugh began. It was soft at first, a faint childlike giggle that seemed to float just outside the window. My blood ran cold as the laugh grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me, whispering in my ear. The laugh echoed, each sound distorted, as if coming from a dozen mouths all around me. My chest tightened, panic clawing at me as the laughter grew louder and more frenzied, overlapping into a chaotic symphony of giggles and shrieks. I clamped a hand over my mouth, praying for it to stop. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the laughing began to fade, receding back into the night like a tide pulling away. I waited, heart pounding, until I was certain it was gone. When I finally emerged from under the desk and turned the light back on, the hut was empty, as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the silence that followed was more unsettling than any sound. I sat back in the chair, trying to calm myself, when a sudden chill settled over the room. I could see my breath fogging in the air, and every hair on my body stood on end. Something was wrong. My gaze shifted to the window and my stomach dropped. There, in the mist outside, stood a tall figure draped in shadow. Its form was blurred by the fog, but I could make out long, slender limbs and a head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. My eyes drifted to the list and I skimmed the rules, heart racing. Nothing matched what I was seeing. The figure moved closer, its form gliding through the fog, stopping just at the edge of the light cast by the hut. Its face was a blank, featureless void, and yet I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, fixed on me. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to distort, like a mirage in the mist, its body bending and twisting in impossible ways. I fought the urge to look away, my instincts screaming at me to hide. But I stayed rooted in place, waiting for some cue, some signal of what to do. Slowly, the figure raised a hand, and I felt an icy dread grip me. It gestured toward the cemetery, a slow, deliberate motion as if summoning me outside. I shook my head, feeling my throat tighten. There was no way I was stepping out there, not with that thing waiting in the shadows. The figure's hand dropped, and it tilted its head further, as if disappointed. Then, with a flicker, it disappeared into the fog, leaving only an empty stretch of darkness where it had stood. I let out a shaky breath, the tension draining from my body. I glanced at the rules, desperate to reassure myself that I hadn't missed something. But everything was as it had been before. Hours passed, each second dragging like an eternity. I remained vigilant, eyes flicking to every shadow, every movement in the fog outside. Then, just before dawn, the radio crackled once more, breaking the silence. The woman's voice came through, soft and urgent. "Henry," she said, "do not leave the hut. No matter what you hear, stay inside until sunrise." I opened my mouth to respond, but the line went dead. A shiver ran through me, her words settling like a stone in my gut. Moments later, a loud banging rattled the door of the hut. I jumped, my pulse skyrocketing as the banging continued, each thud harder than the last. It sounded as though something massive was throwing itself against the door, desperate to get inside. My mind raced. The rule about locking the hut after each time I stepped outside suddenly felt less like a simple instruction and more like a dire warning. Whatever was out there, it wanted in. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay put, each crash against the door echoing in the small space. I watched the first light of dawn creep through the fog, illuminating the graveyard in a pale, ghostly glow. The banging slowed, then stopped. When I finally opened the door, stepping out into the morning light, I found no sign of the intruder, no footprints, no broken glass, just the eerie silence of the cemetery. As I returned to my car, The old guard arrived, giving me a weary nod. He took the rule sheet from me with a small, grim smile. "You're getting the hang of it, Henry," he said. "Most don't last this long." Without another word, he retreated into the hut, leaving me with more questions than answers. After 3 nights on the job, I began to question my sanity. Each night had left me more rattled than the last, and the mystery of the cemetery's rules only deepened with each shift. The twisted encounters, the shadowy figures, and the unnerving sounds all haunted me long after I left the grounds. But tonight, something felt different as soon as I arrived. The air was heavier, almost stifling, and a strange scent, like decaying leaves mixed with old perfume, hung thick around the cemetery. I glanced at the list of rules before stepping inside the hut, the paper worn and brittle as though it had seen countless nights of terror. The radio buzzed almost immediately after I entered, and the woman's voice greeted me in that cold, unfeeling tone. "Tonight will be your last test, Henry," she said, her voice laced with a strange finality. "Stay vigilant, and remember, if you break a rule, there are no second chances." The line went dead, leaving me in silence. Her words echoed in my mind, each syllable weighted with ominous intent. I sat at the desk, checking my watch. My shift had only just begun, and already, unease was creeping into my bones. Around midnight, a strange chill settled over the hut. I'd felt cold here before, but this was different. Sharper, biting, like needles of ice pressing into my skin. I pulled my hoodie tighter, my breath clouding in the dim light. The cemetery was unusually still, the fog a dense, unmoving wall around the hut. Then, from somewhere deep within the cemetery, a bell began to toll. The sound was distant, but clear, each ring cutting through the silence like a knife. My blood ran cold as I remembered rule number 1. Do not investigate any ringing bells, no matter how close they sound. They aren't real. But this bell didn't sound like a trick. It echoed with a strange resonance, a hollow sadness that seemed to reverberate in my chest. Every instinct told me to look outside, to see where it was coming from, but I forced myself to stay put, gripping the edges of the desk until my knuckles turned white. The bell tolled once, twice, then went silent, leaving an emptiness that felt even more disturbing. I tried to shake off the sound, focusing on the rules, repeating them in my mind, as if they were some kind of protective spell. Minutes later, a soft scraping sound came from outside. My heart raced, my gaze shifting to the window, where a faint figure moved through the fog. It was too dark to see clearly, but the figure seemed to be digging, its silhouette bending and shifting with each stroke of an invisible shovel. Rule number 5 flashed in my mind. If a gravedigger comes, do not approach him. Let him come to the window. He will stare at you for a few hours, but will leave after. Do not go outside while he's here. I felt trapped, my only option to sit and wait while this thing loomed closer. The scraping continued, relentless, as though it was carving into my nerves, each scrape a warning. After a few agonizing minutes, the figure approached the window. He, or it, stood there, only inches away, separated by a thin pane of glass. The gravedigger was tall, with long, twisted limbs and an impossibly thin frame. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes shone with a faint, sickly light, like 2 dying stars. He stared at me, his gaze unblinking, hollow, and hungry. Time seemed to stretch, the hours melting into each other as he stood there, silent and still. I could feel his stare burrowing into me, chilling me to my core. I kept my eyes on the ground, refusing to meet his gaze, willing myself to ignore his presence. Finally, just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, the gravedigger turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving me shaken and exhausted. I thought the night's horrors were over, but just as I began to relax, the ham radio crackled to life once more. I expected the woman's voice, but instead I heard something else, an eerie, distorted echo of my own voice. "Henry," it whispered, dragging out each syllable in a sickening mimicry. "Come outside. Come see." I froze, the rules flashing through my mind. Do not answer anyone talking from the HAM radio except for the initial call when you came in. But the voice continued, insistent, almost mocking. "Henry, you're so close. Come outside, I'm waiting." My hand hovered over the radio, the urge to respond growing stronger with each whisper. But I clenched my fist, forcing myself to ignore it. The voice faded, replaced by a low, static hum, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside, soft and measured, circling the hut. I gripped the edge of the desk, my pulse racing as the footsteps grew closer, pausing just outside the door. I took a deep breath, checking my watch. Only a few more minutes until dawn. If I could just hold out a little longer. The door creaked open and I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the gravedigger. Or worse, something unnameable lurking in the shadows. But the hut was empty, the door swinging open to reveal the misty graveyard. I stood, my body tense, ready to bolt, when a familiar voice echoed from outside. It was the guard from my first night. "Henry," he called, his voice flat and hollow. "It's time to go. Your shift is over." But something in his tone felt wrong, mechanical, almost rehearsed. My gaze shifted to the rules again, and my blood ran cold. "If at any point you return to the hut and see someone else sitting inside, get in your car and drive off." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I moved toward the door, my eyes fixed on the figure waiting outside. He looked like the guard I'd met before. Same tired eyes, same worn-out expression, but something was off. His eyes didn't blink, his chest didn't rise and fall with breath. He stared at me, motionless, as though waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped outside, every instinct screaming at me to run. I kept my gaze low, moving toward my car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The figure followed me, his footsteps silent, his presence looming just behind. As I finally got into my car and started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the doorway of the hut, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. I sped away, my hands gripping the wheel, the fog swallowing the cemetery in my rearview. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, my mind racing with questions that would haunt me long after. The cemetery had taken something from me, left a shadow that I couldn't shake. I didn't return for my final paycheck. The risk wasn't worth it. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that faint laughter, echoing from somewhere deep within my mind. The rules. They were more than just guidelines. They were the last line between life and whatever waited in that cursed cemetery.